Welcome to Biology 130 or Biology 135, depending on if you're taking the lab with the course. So we want to talk today about Chapter 1, which is kind of your biology basics. So biology is the study of life, and when we study life, we have to characterize things between living versus non-living. And so when we think of living things, they have to meet a set of criteria, and that criteria, you have to have all those pieces to be considered living. So for an example, if we talk about disease, since we're kind of living in that world right now with COVID, strep, which is single cell bacteria, is living. And we will see that after we talk about the characteristics of life. They exhibit all of those characteristics versus COVID, which is a virus, and it's non-living because they do not exhibit all of the characteristics. So we're going to talk a little bit about those characteristics right now. So the first characteristic of life is that life is organized, and we're organized from big to small. It's kind of how we see things. Everything, living or non-living, is made of atoms, because matter, is, everything is made of matter, whether you're living or non-living. Okay, so atoms will join together to form molecules, and those molecules build into bigger things. And so the next thing is the cell when we're talking about the study of life. And cells are your basic unit of life. Okay, they're the smallest structural and functional unit of life. And we'll delve into the cell in Chapter 3. Then cells build into tissues. Tissues are groups of cells that, they perform specific functions. Okay, and so this slide here, and we're not going to talk about it because you can read, and it's just kind of showing you the levels of biological organization. So then after we go from tissues, you go to organs, okay, and organs are like specific, and we will be studying those organs as we move into our body basics later in the semester. You have organ systems. It's groups of organs that work together. An organism, which is like the whole, us, me. A species, all humans or any species, Homo sapiens, your dog is a species, such populations, all the members of one species that live in a given area, versus a community, which is interacting populations. And then we continue to move on in our organization. Our ecosystem is going to be the living and non-living things in our environment, and then the biosphere, all of Earth. So to be considered living, you have to have energy. You have to get food. And energy is the capacity to do work. And we do that, because this is human biology, of course, by eating. And we consume. We are heterotrophs. We don't make our food from the sun. We have to eat. And that's how we consume our energy. Or rather, we get our energy by consuming. So metabolism. That's just all the chemical reactions that happen in us. Some people say I have a fast one or I have a slow one, whatever, you're metabolizing all the time. That's why you're alive. And even though this is human biology, the ultimate source of energy for all life on Earth is the sun, because we consume plants and they make their food from the sun. The third characteristic of life is homeostasis. And homeostasis is a constant, balanced internal environment. And to be alive and to be living and functioning, our bodies have to be in homeostasis. Our body temperature, our blood acid bases, our blood acidity, all kinds of things in our body have a homeostatic area that they thrive in. So if you're to be considered living, you have to reproduce and develop. And when you reproduce, you pass on your DNA and you pass on your genetic composition. And we grow and we develop. And growth is getting bigger, develop is changing. We go from an infant to a toddler to a child, adolescent, and so on. And the only way that you can reproduce and develop is you have to have DNA. And that is the genetic information of all life. And in Unit 1, we will talk about DNA and talk about how DNA works in our body. Okay, and it contains all of our heredity information, and we'll get really deeply into that later on. So you have to have an evolutionary history, okay? Evolution is how a population changes over time, okay? And that's the genetic part of that population. And we We change over time because of natural selection. And that's the process itself in how evolution occurs. And that's essentially just your genes and how nature affects genotype versus phenotype. Phenotype is your physical appearance. So for example, if you are a frog and you're living in a lush green environment, but there's a brown variant, those frogs get eaten faster by the birds because they're easier to see. And so those frogs don't get to reproduce as much because they're dead and they're eaten. And so the green frogs continue to reproduce, passing on their green genes. Although the brown genes are in the population, you're still going to have some brown frogs. If there's a drought and the environment becomes more brown, the brown frogs are going to live longer and reproduce and produce more little froglets that are brown. So that's kind of, just a really quick little visual of evolution. But we're not really going to talk much about that in this class because it's human biology, more kind of like anatomy and how we focus more on the human body. So to be considered living, you have to exhibit all of those things. So bacteria are living, where viruses are not. Viruses do have DNA or RNA, but they cannot reproduce on their own. They do not consume energy. They essentially are kind of like little zombies. They have to invade your cells to be able to live and reproduce. So viruses they're not considered living things, although they do change, they adapt, they mutate, but they cannot live on their own and reproduce on their own outside of you, and they're not made of cells. So now we need to talk about science as a process, okay? So we need to kind of talk about the scientific method and talk a little bit about how science works, okay? And how scientists evaluate data, how they create hypotheses, experiment on that data, evaluate that data. Sometimes they have to change their hypotheses because of the data that they're getting, okay? And we right now are living through that with the coronavirus. The coronavirus is a novel virus, novel meaning that our bodies have never seen it. So we don't have that picture to fight it. And so our bodies have to mount an immune response and take pictures. And we'll get into this with the immune system later and figure out how to fight this. And so when we talk about the creation of the vaccines, science as a process is happening. We are observing things and we are gathering data and we are changing things at times, okay? And it is because of that data that is gathered by scientists. And science can change as we gather data and we see the experiments and we see the data that's coming in. So science is just a way of knowing about the natural world, okay? And scientists are objective and we're not subjective. Science isn't a belief, like I believe in science. No, science is a fact, okay? And it's objective. We have to have evidence. If you don't have evidence to back your claim in science, evidence that I can perform and you can perform and, they can perform in Europe and they can perform in China, then you're just telling me, it's just anecdotal evidence. You're just telling me what you think, and you have to have data to back that up. And so the scientific processes, we use the scientific method, which is a series of steps. So we always start with an observation, okay? It's a formal way of watching the natural world. We do this with our senses, sight, smell. We use research. We use technology to gather data to find out what we can see and what we are experiencing. And then scientists develop a hypothesis. You learned in high school and middle school, it's an educated guess, but it's not that basic, okay? They observe, and then what they do with this hypothesis is create a possible explanation for that event, for what they're observing. And then you are using reasoning and such to combine facts into a whole for your hypothesis. And understand hypotheses change. Like I could observe something and come up with a hypothesis that seems valid. And then I can do the experiments and try to collect the data and see that I'm completely wrong. Okay. And there's no ego in this, because if the evidence says I'm wrong, I'm wrong. You just throw it out and you create another hypothesis and you do more tests and you gather more data. Okay. And so we make a testable prediction based on our hypotheses. And then we use deductive reasoning to test it. We have if-then logic. If this, then this. And then we use experiments to gather that data, okay? And so we have experimental variables and dependent variables. And you have test groups and control groups, okay? So we use model organisms. With COVID, we use us because we need to, right? So the test group and the control groups would be, like if we're talking about the vaccine, your test group would be the vaccine group and the control group would be the placebo group. But it's a double-blind study. No one knows who gets that. Of course, the scientists have that. But and then you're gathering that, that data, that experimental evidence as we go through. Like, how do you feel? What symptoms did you have when you got the vaccine? And then we draw their blood and we take their data and we do all of the things to gather evidence to see safety and the effectiveness of vaccines. Now, I am making it seem very simple and very short, and it's very complicated and it's tested. And if there's anything strange, they quit doing it and they throw stuff away. But just for our sakes, in this moment, in this lecture, I'm trying to make it short and sweet, okay? So we're collecting and analyzing our data. We get the results from the experiments, okay? And we use graphs and tools, spreadsheets, and charts to summarize our data. And this is an example of one, right? So blood cholesterol over a course of weeks. And so you see what they are, how it changes. So when we collect and analyze data, we use statistics. And once we have collected and analyzed that data, our studies can be published in scientific publications. And they are peer-reviewed, okay? And these experiments are done over and over in different places. And a peer review is actual critical reviewing of your study and your experiment and your data by doing the studies and the experiments and the data. Okay. And then once we've analyzed it, we reach a conclusion of whether we support the hypothesis or not. Okay. And the conclusion of one can lead to another hypothesis and more experiments and more data gathering. Now, a scientific theory, is accepted explanations for how the world works. The cell theory is that all organisms are made of cells, and that is accepted in the scientific community until we have an organism that isn't made of cells. But at this point, all of our organisms, all living things, are made of cells. Okay. Now, a law or a principle is accepted by an overwhelming majority of scientists, like evolution, law of gravity. You have much evidence, huge bodies of evidence in different fields and different factors that support that, okay? And remember that if the evidence changes, theories change, laws change, principles change. So if we're kind of talking about an example of a controlled study, your hypothesis would be that antibiotic B is better than antibiotic A. So you're going to test this. Your control group is a subject with ulcers, and they receive the placebo. A placebo is just a sugar pill. It doesn't have any medication in it. And then the two test groups each receive one of the antibiotics. The double-blind study, neither the doctors nor the patients know what group they're in. The research scientists do, because that's how the data is collected, but the doctors giving the pills and the patients have no idea which group they are in. And then once you get all your information, your conclusion is, for this study, antibiotic B had better results. And this kind of gives you just a graph for you to see what a controlled laboratory experiment to test the effectiveness of a medication in humans. And you can delve into this when you look at your lecture notes. So we need to kind of talk about in our class kind of how environmental factors affect human life and the health of us. And so biodiversity and habitat loss is actually part of that. Technology is just applying scientific knowledge to human interests. And then biodiversity is the number and relative abundance of species and how their genes vary in the different ecosystems. And all of you know what extinction is. It's just the death of a species. Okay. So talking about emerging and reemerging diseases. Emerging diseases are relatively new. Okay, now this textbook came out last year or the year before. So examples are your avian flu, your swine flu, SARS, and MERS. We would now put COVID-19 on there as well. And then your reemerging diseases, we've known about them, but they're kind of considered low risk because they have occasional outbreaks like Ebola. And so why do we have emerging and reemerging diseases? Where do they come from? So, some come from new or increased exposure to certain animals. Some come from globalization because they spread. We have seen that with COVID, how we've seen how it has spread throughout the whole world due to travel. The fact that COVID is a big asymptomatic spreader. You don't seem sick and you're able to spread it. Where Ebola, you are essentially vomiting up black chunks, you bleed from your orifices. Like, you don't want to hang out with that person, right? You are kind of gross and you have something weird. So, that's kind of how diseases spread easily. And then some come when you've got disease vectors that mutate and change hosts. For example, the swine flu. Flu virus loves to change shape. So, and that's why you get a vaccine every year, and it mutates really easily. And so sometimes there are certain diseases, certain viruses that can jump from animals to humans because they mutate and change shape. And then with climate change, it's changes in the normal cycles of Earth's climate due to human activity. And global warming is just your increase in temperature. And the scientific consensus, the scientific community says that climate change and global warming are causing major changes in the Earth's ecosystems. And so those are just some little things that you need to know about the biology basics in Chapter 1. We will talk on the next video that I post about the chemistry of life. Chapter 1 and 2, I just kind of combine so that you don't have to do a Learn Smart in all of them. Chapter 2, you'll have a Learn Smart, but Chapter 1, I'm not going to make you do a Learn Smart. I feel like you can get it all within the slideshow. So your homework and your quiz, though, will cover information from both Chapter 1 and Chapter 2. So I look forward to seeing you in Chapter 2 lecture. Have a great day.